the kind of, it doesn't get the kind of exposure. And so there's a great inequality globally in terms of who publishes and where and what sort of gets published, even though there's a lot of productive work done in our country and elsewhere in Africa, but it doesn't necessarily get the kind of global exposure. So building on scholarship is developing scholarship is important, and I think your work that you're doing here is important. So I'm hoping that our session will be as interactive as possible. So we do a bit of a different kind of presentation. So I will talk, through slides, but I hope that you will stop me and engage with me, and you're welcome to differ with me and ask questions, and don't let me move on to something that I'm discussing that you are unsure of, because I think this has to be I think a different kind of session, so that I just don't talk and I don't actually engage with you. So I hope that we will be able to do that. So let's see how it goes. So I think the topic is an important one, but I'm going to try my best to try and work us through ideas before we come to thinking about simply what we mean by a conceptual framework, a theoretical framework, and also I think I'd like to talk also about a methodological framework, because I think they're different things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my slides. I've got two sets. I'll start with the first set and see how far that takes us. I'm hoping that you will talk to me as we move along. So I think there is confusion around issues related to a conceptual and theoretical framework. And so hopefully we can bring some clarity to that. But at the same time, I need to also tell you where I'm positioned at the moment and where I'm doing sort of my own work, so that don't be put off by what I'm going to say now, but I need to tell you that so that you at least understand it. And if you were to read some of my most recent works, I've largely abandoned the idea of the theoretical frameworks and conceptual frameworks in my own work, and I'll explain that later. And I think it also I'll explain it in the light of some work that is called post-human, but it also aligns a lot, I think, to the way in which we should be thinking if we do draw on, indigenous ways of understanding the world. So I'll come back to that. So what I want to say is, when we talk about conceptual and theoretical frameworks and so on, then it's a conversation that's largely informed by modern Western ways of thinking about research. So I need to say that, and then also at the same time say that I acknowledge that dominates our university, so we can't ignore it. And so that's why we need to talk about it and talk through it. And because structures within universities, for example, the way in which theses are generally structured in conventional ways, as well as how proposals are evaluated by higher degrees committees and so on, takes into consideration largely this Western way of understanding. And so that's why we've got to talk about it and talk through it. So let me share my presentation, the first one. Are you all able to see that?
Yes,
yes,
Prof.
Prof. Yes.
Okay,
yes,
wonderful.
yes, Prof.
So the first thing I want to say, and I hope that you view this positively, because I have to say it. And the most important point I want to make is that there's no recipe. So there's no recipe. So I can't give any recipe to say this is how you would write a framework for a study. All that we can do is to try and work through certain ideas and concepts, and hopefully that gives you a repertoire ideas and concepts that you can actually work with, and that depending on the kinds of questions that the study is asking, you can then draw on that, on all of those ideas and concepts, and then put them together in a way that would produce a thesis. So I don't think there can be a recipe like we can have for making a dinner meal or something like that. So I think that's the first important point that I want to make. Secondly, I think it is important to distinguish between a theoretical framework and a methodological framework. But while saying that, I also have to emphasize that this distinction is relevant only with respect to what I term that should actually be conventional research. So it's only when one talks about conventional research. So why I think this distinction is important is because when you think about a theoretical framework, then that's not the theories that inform the way you're going to proceed in conducting the research. So if it is an empirical study, and by that I mean any study that you use your senses, so in other words, you either observe or you use the powers of the eye to extend the powers of observation through instruments that you use, or if you listen to people through interviewing and so on. That's all, for me, empirical research. And if you're doing empirical research, the theories that inform the way you do research, that's a methodological framework. The theoretical framework relates to the actual topic you're researching. So what knowledge in the discipline is, what knowledge in the discipline is your question that you're asking deriving from, right? So it's got to do with the actual topic itself that you're researching, not the way in which you're proceeding to conduct the research. So theoretical framework to me is related to the knowledge that's developed in the actual discipline, related to the topic of the research, and a methodological framework relates to the theories that inform the way you're going to proceed. In other words, the theories that inform the methods that you select and use, etc., as well as the theories that inform how you will analyze the data. So I think that distinction is important. But I say that this is only when we talk about conventional research that still largely dominates research within universities. And you can think about your own studies, and you can also think about the studies that you've done if you've completed a PhD, and just think through some of these ideas. But as I said, stop me at any point. Now, I think it's important before we even talk about, so what is a theoretical framework? What is a conceptual framework, and so on, is to understand the types of reasoning that derives from philosophical debates, but it's a type of reasoning that's used in research. So the first type of reasoning is deductive reasoning. And so deductive reasoning happens if there's a well-established knowledge or a theory that exists, that has been tested over time, and what you actually want to do is to move from that theory. You generate hypotheses from that particular theory, and you test that through different forms. Often it is done through experimentation of some kind. You produce the data, and from the data, you then would make particular inferences, right? So you're moving from theory to data and then to inference. And that often is done through hypothesis testing. And typically, this is the kind of research that is done largely in the natural sciences. and also in research that's informed by a positive paradigm. And people also talk about this in another sense as quantitative research that would involve the use of inferential statistics. So in other words, it tries to make use of random sampling or other forms of probability sampling, so that you're able to generalize from a sample to a population. So that's the kind of study that involves the studies that are informed by deductive reasoning. So what is important here is that when you talk about deductive reasoning, then those theories that you start off with, or that you derive your hypothesis from, must be well established and tested. In other words, they must hold true until they're, of course, disproven. But at the time at which you're conducting the research, those theories must hold true. So that's deductive reasoning. But you also get inductive reasoning. And inductive reasoning often happens when you don't know, there's not a well-established theory. So it's a new area of research that you're investigating. It's not well known, excuse me. So what you would do is you would either do observations, or you would interview people if you're doing research in the human and social sciences. And then from the research, you will generate data. And from that data, you analyze the data, you decode it, you develop patterns and eventually themes that enable you to develop new hypotheses that can hopefully generate new theory. Now, in the late 1960s, Glaser and Strauss spoke about this idea of grounded theory. And grounded theory is an inductive process where you start off with a small empirical investigation by either observing or interviewing people, and you take it through different iterations by adding more people and so on until you're able to generate a new theory. So that works again from data towards generating theory, and that's an inductive process. There's a third form of reasoning, and that is called abductive or retroductive reasoning. And this is where you move from data to the best theoretical explanation. You infer to the best theoretical explanation possible. Now, it might sound a little complicated, but abduction or retroduction, we actually use all the time in our everyday lives. So let me give you an example. Let's assume that let's assume that you become aware that there's been some crime in the area where you live, and you come home on a given day, and you see that your window is broken, and your door has been opened by somebody. You're the only one that has a key to the door, and you walk in and you see that some of the goods, some of your kitchen cutlery and crockery and stuff have been removed. And then what you do is you make an inference about what has happened, right? And you make that inference based on the information that is available to you. And that inference would be that somebody had burgled your house. Now, there could be other explanations for why you're observing what you're actually observing. But given the information that you have, you are abducing or retroducing to the best explanation that's possible given your Now, we often do that when we conduct research as well. And sometimes towards the end of the study, we might be discussing um, data, and then as we're discussing data and the interpretation of the data, we might go to literature that we didn't review before, but it helps us to illuminate the data or the interpretation of the data. And then in that sense, we are abducing or retroducing. Now, these forms of reasoning are actually important, in my view, to understand before you get engaged with what we mean by a theoretical framework and what we mean by a conceptual framework and so on. So I think this is important background information, because I'm trying to use this to get you to understand some of the foundational stuff and why people use theoretical frameworks and conceptual frameworks incorrectly. So the other thing that has happened is that what the human and social sciences have done, maybe because from the inception of some of the social sciences disciplines and so on, there was almost an inferiority complex in relation to the natural sciences. So what has largely happened is that in educational research, in research in the social sciences, what has happened is because of this inferiority sort of complex, efforts were made to try and mimic what is happening in the natural sciences. So if you could do work that looked the closest to that of the natural sciences, then of course that work would have been regarded as more valid. But because of that history, most of the research that we do in the human and social sciences and in education is still, its foundation is actually still the natural sciences rather than the arts. Now, of course, there is now a movement to increasingly talk about arts-based education, educational research, arts-based research in the social sciences and so on. But that's still a smaller component, although it's actually growing, and we haven't spoken enough about that. So why am I saying this? Because the very idea of a theoretical framework comes from the natural sciences, not from the arts. And so a theoretical framework comes from the way in which research is done in the natural sciences. So that is actually important. So there's actually been what we might describe as the creeping of natural science ways of doing into the human and social sciences, and that has dominated the way we think about things. And we should critically perhaps ask whether that's desirable given the kinds of questions we're asking and that we need to ask, and the context in which we find ourselves in Africa. So that's the other important background information that I want to provide. So here's our problem, and that's why people keep talking about theoretical frameworks and conceptual frameworks and so on. So the way in which templates for research proposals, now they might differ slightly from what I put down there, but in most universities, including my own, when a template is made available, or when people judge a research proposal, then it normally flows this way: that there's somehow a motivation and rationale for the study, there's a problem statement, there's the research objectives and questions, or there might be aims too, and then there's this literature review, preliminary literature review, followed by a methodology that's described, and then there might be a discussion on trustworthiness, issues of reliability, validity, and ethical considerations. Now, there might be slight differences, but generally, I think that's the way these templates look. If you look at the conventional thesis that is produced, and I have examined many of them, so I know that this still holds true. The thesis format is an introduction, a literature review, a research methodology, the presentation of results and findings, that must be in plural, discussion and interpretation of findings, recommendations, and conclusions. So what is the problem? This particular format of the thesis and of the research proposal is a format that fits deductive reasoning. It fits deductive reasoning, and it fits the idea that there is an existing theory that has been tested and well known over time, and therefore needs a theoretical framework. But many studies that are done and the questions that are asked don't actually fit in with a deductive form of reasoning. It's not a narrow empiricist kind of study that involves the use of inferential statistics, but the format that all studies are seemingly made to fit is actually a format that doesn't work for studies that focus more on inductive reasoning and abductive reasoning, and others that are more informed by arts, that are arts-based and not actually science-based. So I hope that you're following what I'm trying to say. Now, the difficulty that that all of us have is that in the institutions, the thesis and examiners might want to see this particular format of a thesis, and a proposal is going to be evaluated on this format, or it's already given. And that makes it particularly difficult for people that are doing studies that don't actually fit this particular format. And at times one must try and be bold and to do studies differently that don't fit these formats and so on, but that's not easy decisions to make, and one should be guided by your institution as well as what the supervisor's judgment is going to be on these matters. But I have to raise this because I think our discussion must be a critical discussion. It also doesn't fit with the way in which one might proceed to work from a more indigenous methodological and framework, and that might throw out the idea of theory as a noun, but I'll come back to that a little later. So this is by way of background, and now what we will do. Before we get into so what is the theoretical framework? What is the conceptual framework? I need to also say that in the natural sciences, theory is, when people use the word theory, then it has a particular meaning, and it fits in with the way in which the natural sciences works, from moving to an hypothesis, when something is classified as a law, when something is classified as a theory. Now, even though the theory itself might be contested and does get contested over time in the natural sciences, but what theory means is not contested, if you get what I'm saying. In the human and social sciences, the difficulty is that what theory means, not only the theories, but what theory means, that's contested. And there's no single meaning of what theory means. Now, I'll show you an example and talk to you about the debate. So way back in 1997, and it's still worth going to look at that debate, there was, an exchange between two scholars in the Harvard Education Review. It was Gary Thomas, and I forget the other one's first name, but his surname was Rajagopalan. So Thomas wrote an article questioning this whole idea of theory and how it is used in education. And Rajagopalan wrote a response, not fully agreeing with Thomas. And then there was also a rejoinder. But in that article of Gary Thomas, he says that theory in education is used in many different ways. So sometimes theory is used as a hunch in contrast to a fact. Sometimes theory is used as the opposite to practice. So you would know about that. And then in dialectics, for example, people often say, but you must combine these two things so that you talk about theoretical practice and practical theory, and then you get praxis, right? That also comes out of some of the Marxist literature. And then theory is also sometimes seen as an evolving explanation. And then people who have done work on reflective practice, like Donald Shern, the guys that started out talking about action research, like Wilfred Carr and Stephen Kemmis, they spoke about reflective practice and started talking about the idea of practical theory as another way. And then theory is also used as a model or as a hypothesis or as a heuristic. Sometimes it's used as a set of principles. You get the idea of craft theory, theory that's generated out of practical work that people do. Get also what you might call scientific theory, where you actually do talk about propositions, logical arguments, and rationality, and so on. So theory means all kinds of different things. And then I say, what about these though? Then there's stuff like grand theory that's used in education. So Piaget's theory of learning might be considered as a grand theory. When people critically reflect on their own practice, for example, then that's called personal theory. And I did explain to you there's also something called grounded theory, which is not a theory that exists at the beginning of a study that's used, but is a theory that's generated through the actual study. So it's about theory building rather than theory testing. Now, I'm raising this so that you can see that in the human and social sciences, in education, what theory means is contested. There's different ways in which people understand this, which is very different to the natural sciences. And so I think that's also important by way of background. So now this will probably interest you more, but the background to me is actually very important. So let's go to the right-hand side first. So a theoretical framework is the application of a theory in whole or in part. It's the application of a theory in whole or in part. Now, this implies that there is an existing, well-established theory that has been tested over time, maybe also contested, but it has endured. When that single theory is used in part or in whole, then that becomes the basis for using a theoretical framework. Now, from my earlier discussions the background discussions, it should be clear to you that a theoretical framework implies that the study follows deductive reasoning, not the other kinds of reasoning. And when it follows deductive reasoning, then it implies it's going to be informed by logical positivism, and it's going to be a quantitative study, probably using inferential statistics, right? Now, because the theory is well established and has endured, it has been tested and contested, it has wider application beyond the particular problem and context. So Piaget's theory of learning, or Vygotsky's theory of learning, has wider application than just a local setting in South Africa. It has been used by people globally and so on. So there's wider application beyond a particular problem. But because it is one theory, its scope is narrow. And the theory evolves from the literature review. And when you use a theoretical framework, it means that from the literature review, you would actually describe the theory in the literature review, or choose to adapt the theory, the existing theory, that then becomes a theoretical framework you're using. And this is mainly used in quantitative research. It should mainly be used in quantitative research. What I want to say to you is what has now happened is that this idea is incorrectly, a theoretical framework has incorrectly crept into the format of theses, the way proposals are evaluated, and now all studies are expected to have a theoretical framework. But it's only meant for particular kinds of studies that involves the application of theory, because the theory is endured, stood the test of time, and has this broader application. So that's when a theoretical framework should actually be used. Now, a conceptual framework, which is now on the left-hand side of that table, as the name might suggest, it's a synthesis of relevant concepts. So when you're doing a study, and either the question that you're asking is not lending itself to the testing of any theory, because that's not what you want to do, or if what you want to research is not very well known, so they're not existing theories to explain what it is you want to research, but you from the literature that you've read and even from practice, you might come up with important concepts. And then what you will do is you link these concepts to one another to provide a guiding framework for your research. Then that is a theoretical framework. Now, notice here, it doesn't have wide application because it's very specific to your study. And so it will relate to a specific research problem that's very local, and that has a certain kind of uniqueness to either the setting, and the questions relate to that particular setting. There's no interest to generalize from this study more broadly. So, but the scope is broader because, and it's broader in this sense, that you're not only using one theory. So you're actually drawing on ideas from different theories or from practice and combining them. So it is created in bullet 4 from a variety of conceptual and theoretical perspectives. So there's no single theory here, but you're getting insights from different theoretical works that you've looked at and that you've read, variety conceptual stuff that might even derive from practice, and you're putting these together, showing the links between them, and they provide a guiding framework for the study. And conceptual frameworks is used in both quantitative and qualitative research. So in quantitative research, that doesn't meet the demands for a theoretical framework, and it would be used in many qualitative studies, because qualitative studies typically are focused on the particular, the specific research problems, that there's no single theory that you can use to explain that. And often it's areas that is not where we don't have enough knowledge and it's relatively unexplored. So that's the difference between a conceptual framework and a theoretical framework. So I hope that you're still with me and that you're following. I'd like to hear a little bit from you, to say whether everything's still clear for now. Is there any questions, comments at this stage? I'm not able to. Oh, there's one. Prof. Nube.
There's a hand from Lusani.
Yes, Prof. Thank you so much for the very good presentation, and you are giving us a thought for, a thought for our thinking. We have to think very deeply about these things, Prof. And I'm glad you are raising these critical issues. And Prof, as as researchers, we are questioning our own practice now.
Yes,
Prof,
yes.
Prof, in terms of the, of the theoretical framework, because I'm in social sciences, and at times, when you are evaluating the, some of the work for, like maybe as an external examiner or the reviewer, and then you are discovering that the theoretical framework does not fit into the study, and now I've learned that social sciences doesn't have the theory. Well, only, but yeah, yes, maybe let me just finish that, Prof. And then, Prof, for me, it says to me that I think we are pushing very hard to have theoretical framework in our studies, even though at times some of the theories that we are pushing do not really fit into what we are doing. So, but because the convention requires that we must have theoretical framework, and that is why sometimes we are so harsh in our criticism when we criticize our students to say, this theory does not fit into this, but we don't have the alternative, to that effect. So, Prof, that's just my observation. I'm sorry if maybe it doesn't make sense.
No, it makes total sense, because what you're saying is exactly what I'm trying to point out here. And for me, it's also frustrating, because it's very difficult to convince other people who don't quite understand, that might serve on committees and evaluate theses, and so on. And it becomes much more difficult for, say, a PhD or a younger student to to break with, in their studies, with these conventions. But the big problem is when we try to get students to create some kind of theoretical framework that's not appropriate, it actually is teaching them the incorrect thing, but it's also leading to research that's not good quality research. But it's difficult when examiners are also going to ask for this theoretical framework, because it has become so entrenched. But there's really a lack of understanding of what the theoretical framework is and where it actually comes from. So if you work in the natural sciences, for example, then in most cases, it's going to make total sense that there's a theoretical framework, because Einstein's general, theory of relativity, or Newton's law of gravitational attraction, so that's a law. But existing theories in the sciences are universally understood and accepted and contested universally. But that doesn't work in when we're actually talking about the human and social sciences, particularly when we're doing work that's of a particular nature and that would become more qualitative. So, so yes, but it's important for me and for us to have this discussion, because we're trying to build scholars to have this broader understanding, and they will work out over time. Young scholars will work these things out over time for themselves, but they've got to begin to engage with these critical discussions, so that going forward we can have committees in universities that are more open and a lot more informed when they are involved in judging, theses. Okay, so now let me go on to say that. So, what's the purposes of a theoretical framework? That's also important. So the first purpose is to test theories that, as I said, have existed for a long time and that need to be tested over and over, as happens in the natural sciences. So if a study is not involved, if the purpose of the study is not to test theories, then the theoretical framework is not appropriate. And then secondly, it's to make research findings meaningful and generalizable. So if the purpose of the study is not to generalize, then you're not going to use a theoretical framework. And then thirdly, to establish orderly connections between observations and facts. And then fourthly, to predict and control situations. So that ties very much to logical positivism, because that's the premise or the intention of logical positivist research. Sorry, John, did you want to say something or not? Okay, I think it's muted now. And then it's also to stimulate research. So I think from this you can see that many studies and many theses that you'll find on Google Scholar that have passed and so on, that's okay, but they've not used they've used the theoretical framework incorrectly. So, for example, a theoretical framework does not belong in any kind of qualitative study. Right, so let me move on. So the next is to talk about a conceptual framework. So if we're going to talk about a conceptual framework, we're going to do with concepts. So maybe we should think about what we mean by a concept, but there are different ways in which we can understand the concept. So a more conventional way of understanding a concept is that it is an abstract description that names an object or a phenomenon. Now we can get concepts of recognition. So if I pointed out something to you, and I said to you that that object that I'm pointing to, it's got a huge stem with a bark around it, and it has branches with leaves and so on, then you're all going to tell me that that's a tree, right? So that's a concept of recognition. So the concept has been tied to an object. And then there are also, of course, lots of human-made objects and so on, but then the concept could also be tied to a phenomenon. So we might use the word weather, and then when we use the word weather, then we're talking about a particular concept of how patterns of temperature and other phenomena and wind and all that play a role to determine the nature of the external environment, and whether it's cold or warm or cool and so on. And then so we've got a concept like weather, that's a phenomenon. And there also, of course, there are also concepts that are the social constructions that humans have actually constructed, like concepts in education, whether it's teaching or learning, etc. Hence providing it with a distinct identity and meaning. Okay. Then a concept can also be viewed as an intellectual representation of an aspect of reality that is derived from observations made from phenomena. So you can also get concepts that have been derived, typically concepts that we might produce through research that we have, for example, conducted over time. And then there are some philosophers that I like that also talk about the concept as things that philosophers create. And so they believe that concepts are not there to represent things, but concepts are things that philosophers create, or that we can create as ways of, with the purpose of transforming the world. So that's the way in which we might look at concepts. So when we take different concepts and we bring them together, and they help us to guide a study, to make that study a lot more focused, then that would be an example of a conceptual framework. So I did say to you that in my own work, now this is not, this doesn't fit in with the conventional work, but I think one can make a link to what I'm talking about in my own work, excuse me, and say that that can have meaning when one also gains insights from indigenous ways of understanding the world. So I want to just read two quotes to you that come out of a recent article that I co-authored with a number of colleagues. And so we say there, we do not use a theoretical framework which has become ubiquitous, in other words, ever present in conventional educational inquiry. A theoretical framework is aligned to the normative deductive approach, which has its roots in logical positivism. For us, theory does not pre-exist scholarly interactions, but becomes through such interactions. Now, I need to perhaps explain here that the way in which theory is used in theoretical frameworks, in conventional research that's deductive, it gives you the idea that theory exists external to the actual study, and then it gets used and drawn on as an external force that must now come and shape the particular study. We arguing that the ideas that we can read about in books and so on, but what we do is we interact with those books and ideas in those books and journal articles, but we're interacting with many other things. And so theory to us is something that becomes through those interactions. So we go on to say that we do, of course, engage with scholarly work of others. So it doesn't mean we don't engage, but when we do so, we think with their ideas rather than our work being framed by others as ideas. So when I read about the ideas of other people, I think with it. It's not something that's external, that's going to shape and inform my thinking. It doesn't frame it, but I think with it. And through that thinking with it, it becomes a child of more than just that theory. It becomes something other. So theory does not exist externally to scholarly interactions. Moreover, we do not wish to distinguish between theorizing, and that's our preference. Instead of talking about theory, we prefer to say theorizing. But there's no distinction for us, like I'm doing in this presentation, between theorizing and methodology. And we view both theorizing and writing as modes of experimentation or inquiry. Now, Barad and Gandover points out that theorizing is a mode of experimentation that occurs through interactions. Now, here they explain, the world theorizes and as well as experiments with itself. Theorizing is a particular form of interaction and as such part of the world. And theorizing, in its radical openness, provides not only possibilities for thinking otherwise, but for thinking otherwise. Briefly, and this is in short, we use theory as a verb rather than a noun. Theory is theorizing. It's something that we do, but it's something that the whole world actually does on an ongoing basis. Now, what post-human scholars believe, or one of the premises of post-human scholarship, is that agency doesn't only reside within human beings, but all of life has agency. And that, I think, aligns with a lot of indigenous thinking in the indigenous world, that there's a oneness in the world, right? There's not, we might make, on a temporary basis, distinguish between different things, but they all, I won't say interconnected, because that still involves separation. They're interconnected. So we always embedded in a world, both, just for the sake of our discussion, both a human world where we interact with other humans and our becoming is intertwined with those human beings, and that's in the concept of Ubuntu. But that's just a microcosm of the interactions that are happening in all of life. And so life itself is intelligent. And life, and when we interact with ideas in books, we're not only doing that, we're interacting with what is imminently present in what it is we're trying to research in those communities. We're interacting all the time with the more than human world, or non-human nature, or the biophysical world. And all of that is agency that forms assemblages that is theorizing. Humans don't theorize or generate theory and things on their own. It's always in assemblages with other humans and the more than, or other than human world, or non-human nature, or the biophysical world. And so in my work, I'm saying increasingly that theory, this idea of something external that we can take, that's and abstracted from the real life context that produced it, is not the way we should be thinking about things. Because any theory, whether it's a theory in the natural sciences or a theory in the human and social sciences, if you think about all the philosophical ideas that great philosophers were produced, they were produced at particular times in history that related to particular context, particular economic, socioeconomic, political context that those theories were generated from. And you can't simply abstract them and say that you can apply them to work in a completely different context and a different time. You can think with those ideas and interact with it, that it can generate, and then the theorizing of that process can generate new understandings that are actually relevant to the context in which the research is actually happening. When you take a theory that was developed 50 years ago, whether it's some Foucault's theory of power that he generated decades ago, and you simply try and use that and apply it to a different context and in a different time, you're then making, you're distorting the context in which the research is actually happening to try and fit in with a particular theory. So that's to give you some sense of what my thinking and the thinking of other scholars are at this moment. I know it's a little complex, and but at least I'm putting it there for you to maybe go and explore and think about more deeply. So part of what I want to do is not to just simply tell you things that's easy to understand and give you recipes, but it's as part of becoming a scholar is to get us all to think more deeply through all of these things. And then another quote from that same article is saying that Jasmine Ulmer said that what we can do is, when it comes to theory, we can think without theory, we can think with theory, and we can also learn to think differently. So thinking about without, that is akin to non-representational research, which is produced by some other scholars, and I won't go into that, whereby notions such as representation, method, proper names, labels, and perhaps even methodology are removed and suspended from research processes. Because as soon as we start using them, it makes us, it distorts the research study into becoming something else that potentially you know, could have become. And so that's thinking without. And so maybe in some of our studies, we can start saying, okay, I'm going to do this research, but I'm going to start thinking without that concept. How do I start thinking about research if I don't use certain concepts? Like if I don't use epistemology, what will, if I suspend that and say, so what will I be saying about my research if I suspend that? And what will I also be saying if I use it? And what will I also be producing if I say, oh, but I cannot isolate epistemology from ontology and ethics, axiology, and then I get, onto ethico epistemology or some concept like that. So that's what we're talking about there. And then thinking with means that we think with theories, processes, phenomena, and data. As we read the work of others, they don't shape and inform our work, but we think with them, with those theories, processes, and phenomena. And such thinking could open up new ways of doing research through creative experiments with humans and non-humans. And thinking differently invites alternatives to methodological orthodoxy and conventional ways of knowing. So this is the first part of what I wanted to share with you. And to summarize, what I wanted to do is to give some background, firstly, to how we get to this idea of a conceptual framework and a theoretical framework. And in order to do that, one must understand that there are three different ways of reasoning, and that a theoretical framework actually fits with the first one, with a deductive approach to reasoning, and that much of these ideas arose through trying to mimic what happens in the natural sciences. And the way in which theory is used and applied in the natural sciences is very different to that in the social sciences. I said that theories in the natural sciences will and have been contested, the theory, but what theory means is not contested. What a law means in the natural sciences is not contested. In the human and social sciences and education, what we mean by theory itself is not universal, and it's contested, and it muddies the waters completely because there's so many different ways in which theory is used. And then we started looking at the distinction between a conceptual framework and a theoretical framework. And we said that a theoretical framework is only used if it's one theory used in part or the whole. It is something that is a theory that has endured and that has been tested and suits more quantitative studies that have an interest in generalizing from a sample to a population. And then in a conceptual framework, that's when you use different concepts that you're able to link to guide a particular study. But that is used in quantitative research that doesn't meet the requirements for a theoretical framework. And if any kind of framework is used, then it's a conceptual framework that should be used in qualitative research, because its emphasis is on the particular, and it's when research is done where either the phenomenon that's being researched is not well known and it's not well documented, and then no sort of existing theories. And because qualitative research focuses on the particular, focuses on localness and locatedness, you can't have come and apply some general abstract theory. And when you do that, you're going to distort the actual research and the findings. And then what I also then did was to talk briefly to you about where I am positioned on these matters, and that my own approach nowadays is to think not about theory as a noun, as a thing that you can, as something that exists in some abstract fashion codified in books that I can take and use and apply. But I'm busy all the time in ongoing theorizing with other humans, with their ideas, and with all of life, which aligns to post-human thinking and the way in which people think in the indigenous world. So that's the first and what's the main part of what I wanted to do. And I must be careful to also just check the time. And so I'm going to close this presentation, and then we can maybe have some discussion and questions, and then I can start on the next part of the presentation, and then talk a little bit about methodological frameworks. So, Prof. Koza.
Thank you, Prof, for this interesting presentation. In fact, it's not a question, it's just to put just a certain situation to say, in order for us to try to understand the theories. When you have to discuss an issue of existence of a Table Mountain in Cape Town, to say in Cape Town there is Table Mountain. So if we were to say we want to prove the existence of Table Mountain in Cape Town, there are those of us who will simply come from the deductive reasoning where they will simply say, I have a theory of taking pictures and videos using technology in order to say, definitely the Table Mountain does exist. Then the challenge that we have there, although we may believe that, but there's a challenge where what will happen if these videos and pictures are only taken from the west side, but they are not taken from the east, north, and the top. So we may have that truth that may change anytime because we are using a theory of taking videos to prove the existence of Table Mountain. And others may also argue to say, I don't like the theory of using Samsung, but a theory of using iPhone, I believe. You see, that belief in these theories is also taking us to different ways. But others will simply say, no, I want people to tell me, I'll take elders and ask them, they will tell me about the Table Mountain. So then the question will be, how close are these truths of the theories that we were told and the theories coming from technology to the truth? The third part that I would like to indicate is that what if someone else would simply say, no, I don't believe those theories of technology and the theories of elders. I want to go to the Table Mountain and go around the Table Mountain and touch it and take my own photos, if are photos, etc., etc. So which of these theories then will give us the truth? So then for me, it's what we have presented, Prof, is telling me that the truth is subject to what we believe at that particular time. I think those are the issues that I wanted to indicate. Otherwise, it was not a question. It was to put some scenery around it. Yes, thank you.
Okay, but I mean, it's useful to have a discussion, about that. So we don't know. Nobody knows what fundamental reality is. So the leading edge scientists in the world, we don't know what fundamental reality is. What we do know, and even that is based on only our knowledge that exists in what we would accept as a knowledge base. We know that the world we observe is a classical world, right? But we don't know whether fundamental reality, nobody can make absolute claims about this at all, Is fundamental reality quantum? Is it a quantum reality? Is fundamental reality consciousness, and so on? We don't know that. So what we do have is we have particular regimes of truth, right? So when I say we don't know what fundamental reality is, so then I'm saying human knowledge, or the knowledge that humans produce in interaction with everything else I spoke about, doesn't correspond with fundamental reality. So when it comes to knowledge of anything, whether it's knowledge of Table Mountain or anything else, there are different traditions, human traditions, where people might have certain beliefs based on oral traditions and knowledge that have been passed on. Then, of course, in the world of science, people will have different ways of accepting certain premises that might be used to be able to, well, I can't say, I'll come back to the issue of verification, to verify that something is what it is. So there's agreements that are made by different groups of people in different communities, both scholarly communities and what we might say on non-formal scholarly communities. There are different understandings of truth and what truth actually means, and done by agreement. So if it comes to Table Mountain, you have to first accept that there is something that is called Table Mountain, and you can probably establish that in different ways, that some notion like Table Mountain does exist, although there is a different name for Table Mountain that Khoi people have given, and so there are some people still living in South Africa that reject the name of Table Mountain. But what I think you were talking about, Prof. Khoza, in the different ways in which you might use to try and verify whether Table Mountain does exist or not, is actually different forms of abduction. So people are gathering evidence and they're trying to give the best explanations for that. So I think there's a lot of abduction that I think is being used. And then, of course, yeah, one can also say, if you accept the premise to be true, that Table Mountain does exist, then you can do different studies to establish what that is. So I want to talk about verification. So the philosopher of science, Karl Popper spoke about observation through the process of induction. And he said you can never verify anything through the process of induction. Now, abduction does that. So in some senses, abduction is a weaker form of induction. So Karl Popper said, and he used the example of swans. Karl Popper said, every time you see a swan and you see that the swan is white, you go to Canada, you go to Switzerland, you go to Australia, I don't know where else you find swans, but every time you see a swan, you see that all swans are white. Now you can abduce that, right? But Popper said you can't verify through the process of induction. But what you can do is the day that you see a black swan, and there are black swans, even though they're rare, Karl Popper said, when you see that, you can definitely say, you can falsify something. You can say, all swans are not white. So you can falsify something, but you can't actually verify it. And that led to people changing this whole idea of a hypothesis into something that's called a null hypothesis that some of you might be familiar with. I think there was also another hand. Somebody else wanted to say something.
Yeah, that is our share, Simele.
Yes,
Okay,
Prof.
Mr.
No,
Yeah.
just a quick one, Prof. I'm looking at the chat box. Tabang is asking, is it possible to use both frameworks, meaning theoretical and also conceptual framework in a single study? I wanted to raise that. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you. I think that's difficult because as soon as you using a conceptual framework, then you're saying there's not a single theory that has explanatory powers that can be tested. So if there is a theory that exists and you're going to incorporate it in a study, it must become part of the conceptual framework. But I don't think the two can. I know I've seen studies that have both in them, but I don't think that that's sound. Because as soon as you can use whatever that theory is, but if you're going to use the theory in combination with other concepts, then it must become part of a conceptual framework. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Prof.
I think I also saw in the chat, because I looked
Okay,
quickly,
hello,
that
Prof.
some people were asking how they go about asking questions.
Hello, Prof.
Yes, sorry, Doctor. Is it Dr. Sani?
Yes, Prof. Thank you so much. My worry with theories is that there are too many, and picking anyone is again another big problem, because you will find that somebody wants to study a single problem, but now that problem has been like embedded within so many theories, to which picking a particular theory that will move you towards the fundamental answer to that particular problem is itself a problem. So how is that? That is the numeracy of the theories themselves are a problem to moving towards the right solution of a particular problem.
So that's why I don't think it's helpful in general. I'm making a general statement. I don't think it's helpful in the human and social sciences in education to use theoretical frameworks. They fit in with the natural sciences. So what we typically do is we draw on ideas from different theorists, and we use concepts from those theories, and we often combine them to give some guidance to our study, and then it's a conceptual framework, not a theoretical framework. Maybe park our questions again so that Prof continues with the presentation. So I think I've got about, am I correct that I've got about 15 minutes left? Is that right? Chair?
Yes, Prof.
No,
yes. But
yeah,
if you
but
still...
you can, but Prof, you can exit if you still have something to give us, because we want to make sure that our students are getting this clear indication on how to move towards the end of their studies with theories or conceptual framework or whatever.
Yes. No. So I just don't want to go over time. So I'll go for another 15, 20 minutes, and I'll stop wherever I am, because I think the people that still want to ask some questions. Somebody asked whether they could park their questions. So I want to now move.
Don't limit yourself, though.
Oh, okay. So I want to now go on to talking about methodological frameworks, right? Because I said I'm going to make that that distinction. So let me share the second. Just trying to locate this. There we are. Are you able to see that?
Yes, Prof.
Yes, Prof.
Okay. So what makes a good quality sort of research design. Now we're trying to come to the methodological side. Not that they're not related, but I would suggest that there is a sort of strong rationale for the study, that there is a clear research question, and that the research question is an appropriate one, and that there is a golden thread from the research question through the discussion of the context, literature review or conceptual framework or theoretical framework, whichever it's using, and the methodology. Now, just remember, I'm talking here about in the conventional type of research study. So what would make a good study, firstly, is if there is the golden thread. So that the main research question must anchor the entire study, so that when you move from the research question, you've got to be able to see that the literature that is reviewed, whether it is in the conventional way as a chapter early on in the study on its own, or whether the literature is reviewed right through each of the chapters, which is another approach that can be taken to break away from the conventional format. The literature that's reviewed must talk to what is raised in the research question. And then from the literature, a conceptual framework can be developed. And then the methodology, the way in which you proceed, must also align to that research question and to the theoretical framework and so on that goes right through the data collection and analysis. So that's important. Now, I found there are different ways in which the word research design is used. So let me just say that. Sometimes research design is used to talk about a particular design type. Okay? So some of you might have done a survey, or others a case study. Others might have done an ethnographical study, an action research study, a mixed method study, for example. Those are design types, right? So that's one way in which we can use the word design. What I'm doing here, that comes from a guy called Kevin Durheim, is to say we can also think about the research design at a meta level. So you're actually using this to be able to look at the study as a whole and to see whether the study has coherence, right? So that's a methodological framework that we're now talking about. So what is important is that there must be a logical fit between these four components. There must be a logical fit. There must be a binding logic. So if you're working within a particular paradigm, then that paradigm must be aligned to the purpose from which your research question will flow. And it must align to the methods or techniques you're going to use. So, and then of course, it must talk to the particular context. Now, if I did a study, and that study was about how all those that inhabit the University of, let's say, the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Let's say we did a study on their lived experiences of the COVID-19 pandemic. So there are different people that inhabit the university. So the academics, management, students, people that perform other kinds of work, administrative work in the maintenance side of things, the cleaning of buildings and so on. So obviously their lived experiences are going to be different. But if you were to do that, you would have to richly describe the context of UKZN and all of its different workers, where it is located, its history, its geography, its culture, and so on, its demographics. And then if your purpose is to find out or to investigate what the lived experiences were of all those that inhabit the university, then that would be your question, right? So can I ask you, if that was the study, would my purpose be, the main purpose of that study, would it be to predict something? Or would the purpose be to understand how people make sense of the world? Or would the main purpose have been of that particular study to empower people? What would you say? Was it to predict, to understand, to empower? What was the main or primary purpose of the research? Anybody, you can just venture a quick response. If I wanted to investigate the lived experiences, how people experience the COVID-19 pandemic, is my main purpose of my research to predict something, or to understand something, or to empower people?
I think, Prof, the phenomenon is understanding.
Correct. The main purpose is to understand. So the paradigm that involves understanding is called the interpretive paradigm. There are also other names given to it. So you can see the paradigm fits the purpose. And how would I go if I wanted to really find out how people what their lived experiences were? What methods would I use to find out about their experiences? You can venture some answers.
Interviews?
Yeah, yes, you're going to interview people. You're going to interview people because you want to know and understand their lived experiences. You might also, sorry?
Narratives, Prof.
Narratives that people could write, exactly. You might even have a questionnaire, but it has to be very open-ended, qualitative data. But everything you said, the techniques align with the paradigm, it aligns with the purpose, and you won't be able to interpret any of these findings if you don't describe the rich context, both of the pandemic, the global context, but also the university and its uniqueness. So in this study that we spoke about now, it's clear there's coherence. So we can use this framework to look at whether a study at a meta level has coherence. And this is a good methodological framework that I think can be used. But what you see in a lot of research is what we call paradigm slipping. So where people don't actually understand how paradigms relate to quantitative and qualitative research, or there's slippage in their work, that they're asking a positivist question, but they're trying to address the study. Then they claim they're using a interpretive framework, and their methods and so on don't sort of align. So, of course, a paradigm is just the common values, beliefs, views, methods, etc., held by a community of scholars that undergoes revolutionary change over time. And then, of course, we have this word people use often, a paradigm shift. But a paradigm shift actually is about when a community of scientists or community of scholars and form, when a community is formed and it's stable and there's agreement on all of the beliefs, the tenets, the methods that will be used. But some people, as human beings always do, start to question those assumptions, right? They question the assumptions, and you get what is called discontinuities. And then some of the people will break away from and they start a new community. And that community grows, and they have a different set of beliefs, assumptions, tenets and so on. And the same thing happens in that community. And that's how we get paradigm shifts happening. Now, the problem is Thomas Kuhn, who did a lot of this work, said, the old professors don't die, and they've got disciples. So when there's a paradigm shift, the old paradigm doesn't disappear. The old paradigm still remains there. And you have multiple paradigms existing at the same time. So even though knowledge has developed over time, the old ideas still exist. And one reason why we're sitting with conventional formats for proposals and so on is exactly that. We actually, even though knowledge has moved and developed, the paradigm that's informing those frameworks and formats for conventional theses, they still exist and they still remain dominant, even though we've had multiple paradigm shifts happening. So what is helpful is to think about what the constitutive interest is of the research when we ask our research questions. So what are the primary purpose of knowledge production? Now, these are not the only ones, but the conventional ones in Western research. One is prediction and control, that the purpose of knowledge is to predict and control. That's how a lot of science, in the natural sciences, it works because people manipulate variables, they control variables and they make certain predictions and generalizations and so on. It's often related to quantitative type of studies, and we would call that fitting into the positivist paradigm. Then there's another knowledge interest to understand, and that fits in with the interpretive paradigm. And then there's also a knowledge interest to emancipate or to empower, and that fits in more with a critical paradigm. And then there's also a knowledge interest to deconstruct, which relates to a lot of post-structuralist work and the notion of deconstruction that might be tied in some ways to critical discourse analysis and so on. So those are the primary knowledge interests. So it's helpful to say, when I ask my research question, what is the primary knowledge interest? Now, in the question we asked in our investigations, what are the lived experiences of all those that inhabit the University of KZN, or what were the experiences during the COVID-19 pandemic? The primary knowledge interest is to understand. So when we take that and we try and frame them in paradigms, then the prediction and control links to positivism, the understanding to all of those types of research listed there in column 2, critical to all of those types of research that fits in, tied to emancipation, and deconstruction to a lot of post-structural, post-modern, post-paradigmatic research. So that's how we align the primary knowledge purpose to paradigms. So that's one way in which we can do it. I just want to switch on my light because it's getting dark. I'm sure that in some parts, like you guys, it is already dark. Here in Cape Town, it's not quite dark yet, but I think that's better. So I'm just trying to say that we can now align the paradigms to knowledge interest, but we can also use other criteria to distinguish between paradigms, and that is, other than the knowledge interest, we can also look at different theories or beliefs. So we can say, how do we distinguish based on ontology and on epistemology and methodology? I don't know whether I didn't add axiology, but we can add axiology too. So how do the different paradigms, what is their view or theories of reality or being or existence? What is their theories of knowledge? What is their theories of how you proceed when you conduct research? And what are their theories of ethics? And that's or actions in the world, and that's axiology. So in the example, again, that we used about the COVID-19 lived experiences study at UKZN. The ontology there would be that we're focusing on the individuals and their being and understanding of reality. That would be the ontology. And the epistemology is that we come to know through interacting with people. There's the intersubjective way in which we are engaging in dialogue, and the methods we use are interviews, narratives, qualitative questions that we might ask, and so on in the questionnaire. And that all links to an interpretive paradigm. And so that's a useful way of looking at it. So if you want to look at those paradigms, the knowledge interest for positivism or empiricism is prediction and control. The ontology is that the world is stable and law-like, just like the natural world is. The belief is that there are some universal principles and generalizations and patterns we can see in the social world. The epistemology is objectivist. How do we come to know? We separate ourselves from the world and we try and look at it in an objective way. And the methodology is often experimental, manipulative, and uses quantitative methods. And then don't tell me I copied. Oh, I missed out on. I unfortunately cut in the wrong one there. But so the interpretive one, I can then explain to you. The knowledge interest is understanding, and of course the interpretive is on ontology. Let me just see what. No, I don't have it. So the interpretive in ontology would then be that the people come to make sense of the world in a subjective way. So reality is how people view reality based on their subjective experiences. And one comes to know by interacting with people in a dialogical way. And what we also, this kind of work often involves qualitative methods of producing data on the methodological side. So with interpretivism, the knowledge interest is emancipation. The ontology is that the world is unjust and so by design. So in an unequal world, the research itself, its purpose must be to make people aware of that unequal world and to, through the research process itself, trying to address issues of social justice and inequality. And then the epistemology is, it is subjectivist, but also transactional because it tries to make a difference in the world. And the methodology is either critical, dialogical, dialectic. Here, theory and practice is brought together in the, so we get practical theory and theoretical practice in the notion of praxis. And the belief of dialectics is that the one can't exist without the other. So when you invoke the word practice, you immediately also need to invoke the word theory. And then a lot of this research is participatory, like participatory action research and so on. I just wanted to say, but in the indigenous, there's an emerging, what some indigenous scholars across the world have begun talking about an emerging indigenous research paradigm. Now, the word indigenous for many people would mean something that's very specific to a certain place, and meaning and lived experience is tied up to that place, including knowledge. But some indigenous scholars have said we must use the spaces that globalization affords for solidarities to be built between indigenous people across the world. And so they said we can also use indigenous with a capital I. And when we use indigenous with a capital I, we're talking about what we can do to understand the common lived experiences of all colonized peoples. And so they came up with this idea that we can talk about an emerging indigenous paradigm. And here the ontology, epistemology, axiology, and methodology is very different. Because in the indigenous world, If we're going to separate these things, and I don't believe they should, that you can separate them. There must be a oneness of all of them, but we're separating them for the purpose of our conversation. So ontology itself is relational. So, a human being doesn't only exist in this human world and understand reality. They do that in connection with other humans. That's the concept of Ubuntu, and with the non-living. So the worldview is a holistic worldview. It's not either an individual subjectivist worldview, and the epistemology is that knowledge itself is relational. So knowledge is shared with all of creation. It's not a narrowly human-produced thing. So indigenous people would always say, when they think about the land, so we talk a lot about the issues of the land in South Africa and so on, and we haven't spoken enough in terms of theorizing about that. And even people who are arguing for that land should be handed back to those who spent hundreds of years on that land and they were dispossessed. They also talk about land as possession. But in the indigenous world, land is not something that you possess. That's a very Western concept, but I understand in our context where we become Westernized and used to it, people will talk about land as possession. But indigenous people always said that land is our teacher. So they understood that knowledge is tied up in the land. So when you dispossess people, to use that word, you're not just dispossessing people from a physical thing that's called land. It's their entire being and soul and the knowledge that's tied up of there that becomes decimated. And we don't talk, I think, enough about that. We only talk about, but in sort of Western superficial ways. And then axiology, that your ethics, your accountability must be to all relations, to all of life. So accountability is not just to the people you are researching, but it has to be accountability to the non-living. And so you can be researching things and saying you're not doing humans harm, but the research could actually potentially be doing harm to non-humans, but not only to non-humans, you could be doing damage to the physical world as well, as we are seeing with environmental destruction and climate change. And then the methodology, this includes decolonizing methodologies, and I also added third space methodologies. What I mean by third space methodologies, all of these things I have written about in different places. If you were to just do a bit of a search, you'll find them. But third space methodologies is this idea that in the contemporary world in which we're living in, there's a whole lot of, we exist in a world where there's been strong Western influence. And our lives are so tied up with Western goods, objects, technologies, and so on. And what one should actually do is to say that Western knowledge should play a much less dominant role, but it mustn't be completely removed. It must be decentered, and when you decenter that, and you can equitably compare that with other ways of knowing, you can find spaces in between the two that become new spaces in which knowledge gets produced on a much more equitable basis. And there are sort of some examples of that we have seen, across the world. Then I want to, maybe I should end with this to say, there's a lot of confusion also around this whole talk about quantitative and qualitative research. To be able to make this connection between conversations about paradigms and so on, it's important to understand that there's a derivative distinction between qualitative and quantitative, and there's also a literal distinction. So the derivative distinction between is that quantitative research is actually aligned to positivism as a paradigm. And when we saw paradigm shifts happening, and we saw the move towards interpretivism, was then called, interpretivist research was called qualitative research. Mainly because in interpretive research, the data produced has traditionally mainly been qualitative. And in positivist research, the data produced has largely been quantitative. So those two things became conflated. As more paradigms developed after interpretivism, everything after interpretivism was just called qualitative research, right up to, you know, Red Indian epistemology in the USA and so on. So everything following the theoretical challenge to positivism has now become known as qualitative research, if you look at the derivative distinction. But there's also a literal distinction, and the literal distinction is at the level of data. Now, when you look at any data can only be either quantitative or qualitative. It can't be anything else. So if it is in the form of numbers, quantitative indices, statistics, then we can say the data is quantitative. If it's in the form of words, prose, narrative, visual images, then the data is actually qualitative data. So it is possible for an instrument to produce quantitative, so if an instrument produces quantitative indices, it is therefore a quantitative technique. And if an instrument produces qualitative data or descriptions in words, then that's a qualitative instrument. So in the derivative distinction, we're only talking about the conversation at the level of data. Now, it is possible in some studies that are considered to be qualitative, such as work in the critical paradigm, that can use both quantitative and qualitative data. But what you're not going to use is you won't use inferential statistics, because that's based on the assumption of generalization. But if you wanted to, let's say you wanted to look at injustice in the schooling system concerning who gets appointed into management positions, then you can use descriptive statistics, because that statistics will tell you that there are more women teachers in South African schools. But when it comes to school principals, then proportionately, particularly in high schools, there are more men that are principals, which shows an injustice. And you can use statistics to show that injustice. So you can use quantitative and qualitative data in certain instances. When you use a more pragmatic way of doing research, and you combine both quantitative and qualitative data, because your question demands that you actually do that, you can also do a different kind of study that's informed by a more pragmatist type of paradigm. And then you get into what we call mixed method studies. So I'm going to just go quickly through this and say that you then also come out. I wanted to show you this. So before I get to the mixed method study, I think this is also a useful framework to use. And that's the framework of field work, head work, and text work. Now, field work would be anything that we're going to do that's going to generate data, right? So we get different types of field work. But when we do the field work, we basically do three things. We either listen to people, and when we listen to people, then we just give it fancy names. When we listen to people and we have very structured questions, we call it a structured interview. If we have some questions, but we allow the participant to also share their views, we call it semi-structured. If we just have one opening question and we let the person talk, we say it's unstructured. And if we interview people in groups, we call it focus group interviews. Then we also observe. So sometimes we can observe in education, we can observe what people do in classrooms. That's classroom observation. We can observe people in communities to get an understanding of how they make sense of the world in ethnographical studies. And we call it participant observation, because we always participating in some way when we're observing. And then we can also extend the powers of the senses by using instruments like questionnaires that helps us to observe, and we can also examine archival, historical documents, and so on. So that's fieldwork. Now, but what we must also do is in studies, and becomes more important at the doctoral level in particular, we must also think. So we must think about, so what are the methodological assumptions? What are the ontological assumptions? What are the epistemological assumptions? What are the ethical assumptions that what I'm doing? What are they? How do I think about them? How can I think about them differently? Then what we have to do as scholars is we must present testimonies to the headwork and the fieldwork that we did. And fortunately or unfortunately, it's the testimony that gets assessed or examined. That's the thesis or the journal article. And so it's the quality of the testament that becomes important. But we also have certain kinds of research that involve text work on their own, like critical literature reviews, discourse analysis, deconstruction of texts, and so on. Now, why I think this framework is also helpful, you get people that spend a lot of their lives, including academics. They just do field work and field work. They go from one project to another doing field work. And sometimes students, postgraduate students, do too much field work. And they generate so much data that they don't know what to do with it. It's useful, and then there's little time for thinking. And thinking, of course, happens throughout the process. These are not three separate processes. And they produce or don't produce. They don't complete their studies. Most doctoral students don't complete their studies in the world. Many academics move from project to project, but they don't produce enough publications. And one of the secrets is to say, when you budget your time, I must use a third of my time on field work, a third of my time on head work, and a third of my time on text work. Now, there's some text work that's going to be happened while you're doing field work. There's going to be some text work that's going to happen while you doing head work by taking reflective notes and so on. So it happens throughout the process, but the testimony is the one that I'm talking about, that you should spend a third of your time to write that up and produce a good quality testimony. So that's also a useful framework. I did show you this before, but that's just to show you the inductive process: theory, hypothesis, observation, confirmation, and the inductive one works in the opposite pattern, where you're actually trying to build theory, as in the case of grounded theory. And then the last slide for today, interestingly, people are doing these mixed method research studies, and they take a more pragmatic approach. But it's important that these studies must only be done if there's a broad research question that demands both the production of quantitative and qualitative data, and that the two sub-questions, that the one specifically talks to the quantitative component and the other to the qualitative component. And there are different kinds of mixed method studies that you can see there. Some of them would happen where the quantitative component is followed by a qualitative component, or the qualitative component is followed by a quantitative component. Then they are called sequential mixed methods design. If to come back to what we originally said, about theoretical frameworks, and about deductive reasoning and so on. The quantitative, when you start with a quantitative component and you move to the qualitative component, then that's a sequential explanatory design. And in this case, you often have to start. Now, you can start with a conceptual framework, but of course, if there is a theory that exists that can be used, it can be a theoretical framework. This is when we already know quite a lot about this topic, and the literature is fairly comprehensive. And all that we're doing is we're trying to provide a deeper explanation to that theory or that conceptual framework or the literature by actually adding a qualitative component to give us deeper insights so that we can explain the findings on the quantitative part. If we don't know the topic, if it's not well known, relatively under-researched, we start with the qualitative component. And that's called, it's sequential because two components follow each other, but it is exploratory. We're trying to explore a new area. Then based on the qualitative data we produced and the themes we generate, we now have findings that serve as a basis from which to design a quantitative survey or whatever you're going to do. Then you get other studies where the quantitative and qualitative component happens at the same time. It's not sequential. That's called a concurrent, triangulation design. So I thought you can see here that this is sort of a deductive kind of approach. This is a inductive approach. This is inductive. That is deductive. And when you do it this way, it's largely abductive. Right. So I hope that you found all of this helpful on your journeys, wherever you are in your journey as a scholar. So thank you very much, Chair. And thank you very much for the invitation. I don't know whether there are any questions that people would like to ask at this time.
Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you so much, Prof. It was indeed an insightful presentation. And as Prof. Ncube has indicated earlier, you are challenging what we know, or rather what we think we know. So let me not waste any further time. I will check hands. Prof. Khoza, your hand was up, and then I will take the first round of hands. Over to you, Prof.
No, it was not. It was not. I was just clapping hands.
Oh, okay.
I was clapping hands. We can continue to the next one.
Thank you so much, Prof. Colleagues, presented. Let me note some hands. We've got a hand.
I think there was just a comment to say thank you.
Yeah, those are comments. Turu, go for it.
Thank you so much, Doc, for the opportunity. Thank you so much, Prof, for this insightful presentation. I'm sorry about this call. Thank you for the insight presentation, Prof. Yeah, it is very disruptive, and I'm told as you get more educated, these are the things you should be doing, challenging the status quo. Thank you so much for that. It got us thinking. I have one question, though, in terms of the frameworks. Do we have frameworks for data analysis, in research? Do we have special, because we have frameworks for, you know, the methodological ones and so on. But for data analysis, is it still under methodological or what?
Yes, so
Thank you.
of course the frameworks must, I mean, I think I don't know whether I'll call it frameworks, but I think they're guidelines in the way you would proceed in doing data analysis. So if it's quantitative statistical stuff, then we know, of course, there's a whole lot of statistical methods that are available, both parametric, non-parametric. So there's two broad categories of parametric and non-parametric statistics, and what you will use would depend on the nature of the data, whether it's, and the scale, whether it's an equal interval scale or a ordinal scale and so on. So there are these categories, and then there's all kinds of methods that you would do for trying to look at causal relationships or correlational relationships and so on. On the qualitative side, we now also have you know, software packages that you can actually use, but it's important to understand what those software packages are doing. And broadly speaking, you can do two kinds of qualitative data analysis. There is content analysis that's done, and you can do a thematic analysis that, and if you read up about thematic analysis, you will be able to see what the approach is to that. Or you can do a constant comparative method if you want to, say, make comparisons in a multiple case study, for example. And then we can also not do a content analysis, we can also do a discourse analysis or critical discourse analysis, and we can also do a deconstructive analysis of qualitative text. So those are more approaches that you can read up about than, I would say, frameworks. So I hope that does help, Turu.
Yes, it does, Prof. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prof. Colleagues, any more
I think there's
hands?
one from Portia.
Portia,
I see
yes.
Portia's hand.
Yes. Go for it, Portia. You are still muted, Portia.
We can see your hand. We see your hand.
Okay. Yes. So, sorry for that.
No problem.
Thank you very much, Prof. and Chair, and good afternoon, everyone. My question is based on the deductive, inductive reasoning, and the abductive. And thank you for
Yes.
that information. So if my study at the end, the theory emerged from the data, but my theory develops from or improves an already existing theory. So am I right to think that my study is taking the abductive reasoning approach?
So can you just say that again? I missed part of what you said, Portia.
I said if my theory emerged from the data,
Yes.
am I right to think that I use the abductive reasoning approach?
If your theory emerged from the data, then that would be inductive, right? If you're generating a new theory from the data, it would be inductive. Abductive would be if you went from the data to a theory that already exists, that gives the best explanation for the data. And if you're using a combination of those two, then you would be using both of them. I don't know if that helps you.
Yes, thank you, Prof.
Okay.
Any other questions? Colleagues, okay. There's a question, Prof, by Sabelo Ngumalo on the chat box. Dear Prof, what a scholar, thank you. Please share a couple of key figures that theorizes or philosophize using the indigenous research paradigm. excluding you. I'm not sure if I'm getting that question correctly, Prof.
Oh yes, yeah. So there are some scholars. So there's a scholar called Stuart, I think it's Stuart Wilson, who came up with this idea. And then there's a lot of scholars in the USA, Maria Baptiste, for example, and then in Botswana, Chalissa. I don't know if you know her work. She's also written a book on indigenous methodologies. So I hope that helps a little.
Okay, I'm seeing a thumbs up from Sabelo, meaning that you hit the nail on its head. Hand is up, Prof. Orodo.
Thank you, Chair. I don't know if you can hear me.
Loud and clear, sir. Go for it.
Thank you. I just want to make a comment and maybe just a small addition. Thank you. The presentation was very lively. I'm sorry also I came a bit late, but that's still fine. There was a very good presentation on the mixed methods, and I think the presenter gave us the sequential ones, explanatory, and then the convergent. But of course, then you also want to move a bit further than that and see the transformative. Those are some of the mixed methods that emanate from any of the two, whether sequential or convergent. And apart from just the sequential, the transformative, you also have the multi-phase, where they move into many phases, particularly when you are making follow-ups. So I think that's quite good. And if that can also be added to the audience, they can know that in mixed methods, we may also need to go beyond the two. Also, another addition, some participant was asking about analytical frameworks, and I think you answered very well. But sometimes the analytical frameworks can also be based on how you actually frame your start point, positivism, post-positivism, and also your paradigms themselves. So at analytical level, then you want to see if you are, let's say, going to look at multi-mixed methods for that matter. Of course, then it means that you must be very conversant with both the quantitative and qualitative. So your frameworks must also be reading through, because when you're going to do the quantity in the explanatory method, it means you must be conversant with the descriptive, inferential, and so on. And then when you want to follow it with the qualitative, as it were, then again, these are the qualitative approaches, analytical processes like the grounded theory come in very ground, and very necessary. So I think in short, I'm just making a summary, but all related and said, geared towards saying that the presentation was quite good. Thank you.
Thank you for your contributions, Prof. I saw a hand from David, but it disappeared now.
David? Maybe
I
his
think he
question.
left. Oh no, David is back.
David?
Well, am I audible?
Loud and clear, sir. Go for it.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you very much, Prof, for the this presentation. But I want to understand, are you saying that in my research work, then I cannot have a conceptual framework and then later on go and have a theoretical framework? Is that what you are saying? You are saying I must be saying I use concepts from the theories that I want to use in my study, but not to have a theoretical framework after I have had a conceptual framework. I think I didn't get that very clear. If you want to go back to that and say.
Yes, in terms of the way in which I described it, but I would think that, and I'm assuming that if your study is not mixed methods, I think if it is mixed methods, there is a possibility of having both in the study. But if it's not a mixed method study and you're not drawing on a single theory, but that theory is used in combination with other literature and concepts, then it should be part of a conceptual framework. Then I think you can't have both. In a mixed method study, I think it's possible. I don't know if that helps, David.
Okay, it's because my study is a mixed method study, so I was trying to take a piece from here and that, but when you were saying it, I was like, oh, maybe I should go over again. Thank you very much for clarifying that one. Thank you.
Okay, so if it's mixed method, yes, then it is possible.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, Prof, before I even hand over to Prof. Khoza and the coordinators, I would like to extend our heartfelt gratitude and your insightful and inspiring presentation has really set a tone for this workshop. And to be honest with you, these workshops are very, very helpful to us as students and also mentees, because they always bring new knowledges, and also they challenge our ways of thinking, and we have contributed that with your invaluable perspective regarding things that are happening around theoretical framework. So thank you for your time and dedication. I'm going to hand over now to Prof, Khoza, and coordinators to pave the way forward. Thank you so much. A round of applause, colleagues.
Thank you very much, Chair. Can I I'm assuming that, do I still have to stay for the rest of the discussion?
Prof K, please advise. Professor Khoza. Where's Professor Khoza now? Dr. Mpungose, are you in? I don't see any. But nonetheless, Prof, the next...
No, I'm back. Yeah, no, thank you so much. It's just that I'm away from home. I'm in Mauritius now. The network here is on and off. But anyway, I'm back now. Thank you very much, Prof, for everything, for taking your time to compile the presentation and do everything. So we'll have the last request from your side that please help us with your slides so that we can then circulate it to all participants. And then also, I don't know if you'll allow us to, because I've recorded the presentation and discussion, if we share your presentation with the world through the link that will be generated. Do you mind if we distribute the link?
No, I don't. No, I don't mind. And I'm happy to share the slides. So I'll send it to you, and then everybody can.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Prof. Because we have to consider the issues of ethics. We should not publish your presentation without your knowledge. Otherwise, you may end up suing us.
Yeah, no, not
so
a problem. Not a problem at all.
Yes, thank you so much. So we'll invite you again. Don't run away too much, because we still need your wisdom in what we are doing. So what we have now solved for us, the issue of conceptual framework and the theoretical framework and methodological framework, that's what our students and colleagues would like to understand. So we've understood it well. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, we'll meet you again whenever there is another section that would like to ask you to present. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to say goodbye, because in 15 minutes I need to be in another meeting, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you,
Bye-bye
Chair.
for now.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, colleagues, the next part of our program then is that tomorrow, unfortunately, I will not be able to connect because I will be traveling from here where I am, right, in Mauritius to South Africa. But Dr. Shoba will open the system so that our students and colleagues who would like to present their work will be able to do so. I have 2 students who have just indicated their interest that they would like to present tomorrow. But if you are also interested, you can send your email to Dr. Shoba. Her email is Shoba, SHOBO, Shoba, M for Makosi, at ukzn.ac.za. So you can send it to her. She will then put your name in the list and then we take it from there. And then the presentation would then take, it will depend how many students we have tomorrow or colleagues who would like to present their work, then we work according to that. But usually 10 minutes should be enough for us to have the gist of what you are trying to do. And then to really use this opportunity to display your work so that we'll all support you and help you with wherever we can support. And also Professor Thalela is back this time as well. He will be there with you. And then Dr. Mabuza also is back this time. He will also be there to guide all the proceedings. Therefore, I encourage all of you, if possible, just to target to present tomorrow, and then we'll be able to critique and support you on what you are doing. Okay, so in closing then, I would like to just to acknowledge all universities that have participated, and then the participation, I would like to give just one member from each of the universities that are here with us, starting with the National University of Lesotho. Any word from Lesotho, please? National University of Lesotho.
Good evening, Prof. I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Hello. Yes, we can hear you, Dr. Makumane. You go ahead.
I know. I would just like to say we really, really appreciate this platform. I was talking to Dr. Nkosha about the relearning and unlearning some things, and the presentation that we just had today was an eye-opener, and I'm just yeah, I'm overwhelmed, but in a good way because I learned a lot. And I'm sure if I'm learning a lot like this, it's more even for the students. So we really do appreciate this platform a lot, and
Thank you.
we are looking forward to more. Thank you, Prof.
Okay, thank you so much, Doc. Let's get someone from Eswatini, University of Eswatini.
Hi, Prof, everyone.
Hello. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm Miss Pim Kontakoza. We really appreciate this opportunity, and it has enlightened us further on research. I believe that the more we collaborate, is the more we will get empowered and we are going to improve. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. From Kenyatta University, the Kenya side. Anyone from Kenyatta University?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I don't know if the chair is here, but if not, then I can take this opportunity to say that from Kenya, and particularly from Kenyatta University, we are very happy that this program is on, and the learning is quite real. From the feedback on the chat box, we can see that actually there's a lot of appreciation for the good work that this forum is giving. So from Kenyatta University, we just want to wish that this program should continue, and we hope that we shall meet in another forum. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. I think then next time I'll open to other universities like University of Fort Hare, University of Pretoria, Northwest University, University of Namibia. But because of time today, let's stop there and then say we'll meet tomorrow at 8 o'clock in terms of South African time. And then our student will be presenting, starting with the two that have already registered their names. Thank you so much, colleagues. Let's close for now. Bye for now. So bye for now, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Prof. Bye.
Thank you, Prof.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for presentation.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye, Prof. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Prof.
Goodbye,
Let's
bye.
say.
Bye-bye, Prof.
Thank you. Bye-bye.